Um, there you are. So I just want to thank everybody for coming tonight. Pam Mack is with us to talk about the new school policy, and I think you'll get a lot of great information out of that. And then we will also send that fact sheet out to those that weren't able to join us tonight. Pam is also gonna, in the future, we haven't scheduled dates yet, but we'll do a three-part series on common ground on IEPs and 50, is 504 included in that, Pam? Yeah.
Yeah.
So she will watch for some information on that. And then Chetty and I are working on also another extended learning call regarding creating an emergency plan for your kids with a special health care need. So that will be coming out too. So without further ado, Pam, I'm going to let you take it away. And I just appreciate your willingness to do this. And we will put the recording up on our Facebook page as well, our Facebook page and on our Family Voices website as well. So go ahead and take it away.
All right. Well, for those of you that I may not have met previously, I'm Pam Mack, and I am with Protection and Advocacy. I've been with PNA for 26 years, and I am one of our program directors in our Bismarck office. And I've actually been doing special education work and just the whole 504 IEP process for about 36 years now. And in that process, one of the things that I am a really strong believer in is creating opportunities for self help and empowerment for parents and family members. And so I track and participate in a lot of education based legislative activity during the session and also then during the interim. And one of the topics that I tracked more bills than I could count during this last legislative session was related to the use of electronic devices in schools. And of course, we most oftentimes hear them just called the cell phone bill, but it is much broader than that. And so I think part of what our purpose for creating the fact sheet that I'm going to show you and use for some of our discussion today was to really help educate, but then also make sure that students and parents know what some of the exceptions and the allowances are for students that have disabilities. Because in the original form of the majority of the bills, that language was not in there. And it did not have any exceptions that were based upon a student with a disability and their need to utilize that device in some manner. So, really wanted to just take some time this evening and share information about what was signed into the law. And then over the past month or 6 weeks, as the school year has been introduced, some of the things that we have seen in parents calling us and in some of our work with the schools. And I think just the overall implementation of the law, because we are definitely seeing a variety of different factors come into play. So, as I said, there were several bills, both in the House and the Senate, and they all had a little bit different flavor to them. They all had a little bit different method of enforcement or method of control. But the bottom line is the proponents of legislation to restrict electronic devices in schools really was based upon the intent that there is research that is showing that they were interfering with learning, that the use of them in classrooms, the distractibility that was coming as a result of their prevalence, and the method in which they were using was becoming detrimental to students. And there is a lot of different research. It's conflicting in some perspectives, but I think overarching a lot of the testimony that was heard during the session created that understanding that it was impacting learning, and we needed to get children away from their devices, back in the classrooms, engaging with one another, engaging with their teachers and their peers, and having that become something that was no longer taking every minute of their waking time when they weren't doing something. So the final bill, there were 6 or 7 different bills, and they took a tremendous amount of time to move through the session because there were so many different versions, and you had people testifying one bill after another bill after another bill, all 3 in a row, and then sometimes 2 days apart. And there was a lot of work that had to go into figuring out what was the best legislation and ultimately what was going to be the passage of the final bill so that people could agree upon it, because there were differing opinions on different sides of the aisle, different chambers within the legislative process. And as we know, our governor and our first lady were very, very, very involved in the passage of this legislation. It was a personal focus area. They both testified on several of the bills and really were strong proponents of taking back some control in our classrooms with children and the use of electronic devices. So the final bill that was passed actually was Senate Bill 2354. There is some differing information out there because there was also a House bill that passed at the same time. And so we actually had 2 different bills that passed both chambers, but they were slightly different. And ultimately, the one that the governor signed and put into law was Senate Bill 2354. So, just some key aspects of the legislation that it's important to understand is that the legislation did define what is a personal electronic device. And that really became encompassing of something that was portable. It had the capacity for voice, text, or other data transmission between multiple parties. And then it was inclusive of smartphones, cell phones, Bluetooth enabled devices. So that could be a smartwatch, a little handheld device, tablets, or reading devices, wearable devices. And then we also have several gaming devices that accompany gaming systems that have that same capability. So that definition is very broad, and it is encompassing of all of those different things that allow you to transmit information in one manner or another. Along with that, though, there needed to be a clear understanding that many of our schools within the state have technology in place, and that's the main platform for learning for students. So we have school-issued laptops, school-issued iPads, or reading devices. And so it needed to be very clear that the legislation, excuse me, did not include those school approved or school owned devices. And so there's a distinct differentiation between that and what's allowed within schools and classrooms. The other thing that was very controversial in the legislation was what part of the school day should be restricted and what part of the school building. And so that was an area in which there was a lot of differing opinions on, well, they should just not have them in the classroom, but we don't care if they have them in the hallways or in the bathrooms or in the lunchroom, or if they go to study hall, we don't care about that because they're not engaged in instructional time. And yet, the more people were talking about some of the research and the studies out there, it was felt that that still would provide so much distraction that it may not achieve what the ultimate outcome was that proponents and people that are supporting the use of restricting electronic devices in schools was wanting to accomplish. And so there was a lot of discussion about that. And ultimately, the legislation came out and it says during instructional time. And that instructional time is what they call bell to bell. So the first bell of the day in which a student starts their school day to the last bell of the day of dismissal time is the period of time when students have to have their personal electronic devices powered down, put away, not seen, not used, and not available to them. And so that was really kind of a big deal because then the discussion was, well, what if we have students, say in high school, that are leaving for part of the day? Well, if they're off school grounds, then they're not considered to be in that bell to bell time. But if they come back to the school grounds before the final bell of the day, then that restriction goes back into place that they're not supposed to have it turned on, available, cannot be seen, cannot be used, etc. The other thing is it also covers the ability to restrict that and or minimize its presence during school related activities. And so there are some districts that have included that, and that extension of not having it available is stretched to, say, throughout the duration of a volleyball practice or throughout the duration of a football practice or a football game, and those devices must be put away, stowed, not turned on, etc. So, one of the things that all became part of that then is recognizing how that was going to occur in each individual school. So, the legislation identified that each district needed to adopt policy that they would be using across their district. And then there were criteria in which the policy must address that from that bell to bell or during instructional time, the cell phone needs to be silenced or turned off. It needs to be stowed away in some manner, and every district had the ability or the capability to determine how they were going to accomplish that. And it cannot be used and it has to be inaccessible to students during that instructional time. And then the policy would also need to identify if there's going to be restrictions during school related activities, how is that going to be managed? The policy also needed to include what are going to be student infractions or the result of not complying with the policy. What would those responses be? And how would district administration and teachers be implementing the policy? And there needed to be upfront a very transparent message that students and parents had before the school year started so that they understood what that consequence would be. Then the last thing was, of course, people were concerned about school safety and what happens if my student or my child needs to call home, they're not feeling well, they need to call a parent. And so it was required that schools must have an electronic device that is available for students to utilize if there's a need to contact a parent during instructional time. and that the use or the availability of that needs to be adequate in order to allow for students to do that without delay and without problems. And so schools needed to determine what that was going to be, where they're going to be located, and that there not be a limitation if a student asks to call their parent. So those are kind of some overviews of the legislation and the policy. So I'm just going to take a pause there and see if there's any questions that folks have before we go on to what some of the exceptions to the law are.
Any questions on what you've heard so far?
Okay. Well, we'll go on, but we can come back and make sure that everyone has an opportunity to ask their questions so that we can cover them if need be. So, one of the things that um, I found problematic from the get-go in all of the legislative bills that were drafted by Legislative Council at the request of either organizations, entities, legislators, etc., is that there was not any language for exceptions. And I know many other of our advocacy partners shared the same concern. And so when the series of bills were first heard, P&A did submit written documentation and asked for the addition of language to the legislation. And we kept reiterating that on every single version of the bill. And fortunately, we had a couple of really good legislators that reached out to me and said, give us what the language is, just write it for us and give it to us. And we're like, you got it. So, fortunately, from that point forward, there were amendments and additional versions that we were able to keep coming back to saying you must ensure that there are exceptions, there's accommodations, and that you will not prohibit a student with a disability for using a personal electronic communication device if they have a health and safety or health and well-being need. So they have a healthcare condition in which they need to have access to that cell phone. That could be, monitoring blood sugar, monitoring pulse, heart rate, oxygen saturation. I mean, many of our applications now on personal electronic devices do some incredible things that help us stay ahead of crises with healthcare issues. The other thing is if there's a student with a 504 plan or IDEA and an IEP, and part of that involves needing to possess and use a personal electronic communication device, regardless of what the reason is, that should not be restricted. And so the key with that is making sure that there's a direct correlation between the use of those devices and the student's disability and or healthcare condition, and that we have all of that documentation and information to support why we're asking for an exception to the law. And of course, that should be in written form. It should be part of a plan. It should be spelled out and identified, and something that's reasonably understood for any school official that might in some way attempt to restrict or limit the use of that communication device. And so in that process, that has been probably the most critical piece, is how do school officials know that that exception is in place for a student? So we'll talk a little bit more about that. So then just at the end of the fact sheet, we have a link to the actual legislation, the bill, and the century code that was adopted as a result of that legislation. So I did put the link to the fact sheet in our Zoom chat for the meeting, and it's also available in a couple of different sections on the PNA website. And so you're always welcome to access it from any of those locations, and or just contact us, and we're happy to walk through it with you, share it. Feel free to share it out in any mechanism you want to, because it is not protected in any way, and we want it out there. We want people to understand it, and we want it to be used, because what we don't want to see happen is that people are restricting that access and that use inappropriately.
Mhm.
So part of what we are seeing from a PNA perspective, and I supervise our intake staff, and so I had an opportunity in preparation for our call today to ask last week for my intake staff to give me some examples of the calls that they've received. And what I find most interesting is we've kind of had two different perspectives. The first one being school staff are not aware of the exception because they either haven't read their district policy, or when they skimmed the student handbook, they just looked at what the restriction was and they didn't look at the fine language below it. Or they're aware of it, but they're taking a position that they don't need to follow the exception. So those are kind of two of the things that we're seeing on a regular basis that people are calling about. Parents are calling and identifying that, my child had their phone out today. They were checking their blood sugar and they were sent to the office. And the office took the phone, and my daughter was told that she could come and get it at the end of the day, and was told and had to sign a document that if it happened again, then the office would take it, and then the parent the next time had to come and get the phone. And even when the student identified that they were checking their blood sugar and it's part of their health care plan, the teacher and or school official did not allow that exception to be utilized. The other thing that, when I was talking with one of our intake staff, while it said in the 504 plan for a student that they utilized a Dexcom and electronic device for managing their diabetes, it didn't say anything about that interface between the student's cell phone. It just said electronic device. So the school staff took that to mean the Dexcom and the insulin pump, and believed, with their limited knowledge, and I'm going to say that very seriously, that the cell phone wasn't necessary because they had those other electronic devices. But that is not what the intent of the law is. It isn't how it's written, and it is not a means or a justification to restrict access to the person's cell phone, which we know that their cell phone interfaces with the Dexcom app so that they have access to their blood sugars at all time. So we've had to go in and educate some school personnel, educate some administrators, and likewise, I think some of that is a reluctance for teachers and or personnel to be flexible when there's a need to do so. So those, I think, are just some of the most significant things that we have seen come into intake. So the other thing that I did before our call today, because I wanted some perspective of the other side of the fence, I'm married to a high school teacher, and he teaches in the advanced chemistry program in our high school. And then I also have a daughter that's a fourth grade teacher and a daughter-in-law that's also a teacher in a different high school. So I asked the three of them, tell me now that this law has been in effect for the duration of the school year, what do you think about it? And all three of them said it's the greatest thing ever. And I thought that was so interesting because initially we heard a lot of pushback from special education. Um, I'm sorry, not special education staff worried about implementation. Um, so I think they were concerned about how that was going to actually be handled and how it would play out. But what is interesting is all three of them said, we literally do not even see them. It's like the first day of school, students knew because that was the first thing that was covered over the PA system, and they were told what the expectation was. They understood what stowed away, turned off, and not seen was, and it literally has not been a problem. Now, my husband said the funniest thing was watching high school juniors struggle the first couple days because they hadn't talked about where they were going to meet all of their friends to go to lunch. And they were so used to having that cell phone right at their fingertips to coordinate their lunch plans that they forgot to do it in advance. So they had to figure out how to do that without a cell phone. And so the second day was a little bit less chaotic. And by the third day, they had kind of pretty much set where they were going to be meeting. So that was the most chaotic thing was lunch, which I thought was just absolutely hilarious. Um, and they just have said students are coming into the classroom. They're actually talking to one another. They're turned around and visiting with their neighbor and you know, they don't miss them. They literally don't miss them. And nobody even complains about it. So I just thought that was really kind of cool. My daughter's a fourth grade teacher, and many of the fourth graders that she has had up until this point in time were just getting their first cell phones and were struggling to not let that become a significant distraction in the classroom. And they really kind of had a little bit of an infatuation with them. And she said they don't miss them at all. They don't even come in the classroom. Um, you know, her method of stowing them is in their backpack in the hallway, and it has not been a problem. So that's just kind of what I can share with you about some of the law and the anecdotal perspective from a few teachers in my life and just what we've heard from PNA. So I'll just kind of open the floor, and if you guys have had any experiences, we'd love to hear about them. And I see we've got a question in the chat. So, have you heard of any issues related to assistive technology devices? Tell me a little bit more about what you mean by AT devices, like communication devices or iPads for communication, or is that what you're referring to?
She got off.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm going to kind of make an assumption that it has to do with the use of like an iPad and like Proloco to go and some of the means of communication through electronic devices. And no, we have not, that I'm aware of, heard of any challenges with those not being allowed um, or accommodated within classrooms and or the district. Now, I know one thing that there has been some clarification of is in non-structured time, when is it available for use and what can be used on it. So there are some additional restrictions to apps that have been allowed and say gaming platforms versus educational games and those types of things. So I do know that districts have restricted the applications that are allowed, even if it's a personal device, because that starts crossing that line into inappropriate use during school time or instructional time, I should say.
Courtney's back. I don't know. Did you get bumped off, Courtney? Did you have any assistive technology device in mind when you asked the
Hey,
question?
I'm so sorry. I am putting my son to bed
Oh,
and
it's okay.
I I hit the wrong button on my headphones and ended my call instead of unmuting myself. Um, so I am a parent of a couple kids with disabilities, but I also work as an assistive technology consultant for North Dakota Assistive. And so Um, I just was wondering, I haven't heard a whole lot of issues from my end about, students that maybe use like reading apps. Maybe a student with dyslexia or who needs a reading app. So that's kind of where my question was coming at.
No,
Um,
Perfect question. And I don't think we're seeing any difficulties with that. And again, it probably goes to that, is it an approved app and one that's tied to instruction? And if it is,
Sure.
we just don't seem to be having any challenges with that. So,
Awesome. So as long as it's well documented,
yeah,
no issues.
absolutely. And we want it to be both in, if it's used for communication and learning, we want it to be in that actual content of the goal and the objective, but we also want it to be in the adaptation section. So there is just absolutely no question whatsoever that the use of that AT and that technology is an adaptation, and it needs to be supported in that educational environment and not limited. So we're trying to make sure that people really understand, don't just put it in the implementation component of the goal and objective, because that doesn't show that it should be available across the entire school day. It that shows when we're doing the data and running that goal and objective, we need to have that support. But if it's in the adaptation section, that crosses over every modality of that plan: special education, related services, transportation, um, activities, school activities, sports related activities, concerts. So, in that adaptation section, it's imperative that it be included in there too. So, really just making sure that it's not missed anywhere.
Can a school district push back on whether or not they put those adaptations in the IEP or 504 for like a device, for like a Dexcom or even a communication device? I'm wondering because I live in an area where the school district thinks that they can kind of make up their own rules when it comes to IEPs, and I want to make sure that I'm well versed in um, the actual state, um, I guess, rules and regulations, when if this were to ever come up.
I would say no, they would not have any capability to push back, because there are two different sections within IDEA where it clearly asks and outlines the question and the need for assistive technology or technology to aid in learning and participation and benefit from their education. So if it's within that perspective and or part of a healthcare component of their plan, there isn't any ground that they have to stand on to limit it. And so I would definitely see that as a rights violation and one that P&A would most definitely want to address. So if you ever end up in a situation where you have a district that is not allowing for that use or that method of implementation, that would be a focus area or a priority area for P&A and our educational advocacy. So definitely reach out to us and we will help address that. That is one of the reasons why we also did the fact sheet, because we're hoping that it becomes something that people recognize. Before you say no, pay attention to the fact that there are exceptions and you need to look at that.
This is Courtney. So part of my role with North Dakota System is currently part of the AT Builder program, which is through the Department of Public Instruction. So we're working to increase assistive technology capacity of special education units across the state. And so there we have a couple liaisons at DPI that would also be there to come to bat for you, Abigail.
Absolutely.
And so we'll be happy to do it. We can as well.
Perfect. Thank you.
And Rochelle, I did read your note in the chat. They should not be saying that his Chromebook is the thing they will allow and not allow the use of the phone if that is something that is an adaptation, modification, or component of his IEP and a need for his disability. So feel free to reach out to us and we can help you with that, because if it's decreasing his ability to self-regulate and provide him with that assurance that he's got a connectivity to you, if there's a need for him to use that, then we definitely would want to address that, but they should not be restricting it.
Good question. Any other questions for Pam at all?
Just a quick question about headphones. Do you have any advice on that for utilization of headphones for, I guess, listening, I guess more of like day to day, like coping or in the classroom for reading, or say if they are needing to go for quiet time for like music or whatever it may be. We're getting a little bit of kickback like with the use of headphones. Just
Were
because
the
they're a Bluetooth, yeah, they're a Bluetooth device. If they're a personal one, that's kind of where the kickback is coming from on my end.
Was that Bluetooth enabled headset allowed last year as part of the IEP or 504?
Yes.
Okay. Then I would say the same use and adaptation for it being a piece of technology. This isn't just an electronic device. It is technology usage. So it is one of those things that should not be restricted just because of this change in legislation. So that I definitely think would also be what we would consider to be a violation.
Okay, that's what I thought too. Thank you. I appreciate it.
You bet. I did put my cell phone, sorry, my work phone number in the chat. And I'm also putting our intake line. So folks are more than welcome to contact us, and if there's a need, let us know. But feel free to share our flyer and our fact sheet with others and Deneen at some point in time. If there's a need for us to do another session, just let me know, and you're always welcome to email me too.
Sounds good. Sounds good. I really appreciate you going through this. There was even, I mean, there was some information in there too, Pam, that I hadn't even thought about. So it was great information. So, what I am gonna do for those of you, I'm gonna send out the, fact sheet. Plus, we'll also send out the recording as well, and then we'll also put the recording up on our website. So, um, uh, any last minute questions at all for Pam? Hearing none, I hope you guys have a great evening, and thank you so much, Pam, for doing this. I sure appreciate it.
Anytime. Take care, folks.
Okay, bye-bye.